listen to fall to gold.
Hello, welcome back to another pen talk. Today is going to be a discussion of ink, green ink in particular. What motivated me was this Robert Oster ink that I got at the DC Pen Show. At that time I was in the green mood, so I got Jade, a little swatch of the color at the top of the cap. These inks have gotten a lot of press, a lot of discussion on the internet, so one of my viewers asked me to look at this ink, so it gave me motivation. But I didn't want to just look at the ink, I wanted to look at green inks in general, because I did buy some other green inks while I was at the DC Pen Show, and I put together some of my green inks. As you can see, there's a number of them there. Sad to say that's not all my green inks, but that certainly is a good representation. So as we look in these to a little bit closer view, there's Robert Oster Jade at the front, Papier Plume Ivy Green, Pelican 401 Brilliant Green, Private Reserve Spearmint, KWZ Green number 5, the Franklin Shussoff Franklin Green, and Emerald 357, a standard Roher & Klinger Alt Gold Grun, that's S&K Palm Green, Noodler's Forest Green, Cross Green, and J. Urban Vert Empire. There's a lot of variations in these greens. Hopefully that's coming out in the video. I have a little bit of different lighting here, so I'm hoping that that shows the color. I was using a glass pen, which lays down a lot of ink, and I like the smears. A lot of greens with blues, a lot of greens with greens. Some greens that don't even look like green. So there's a lot of variation there. If you go up and look at the chromatography, you'll see that Robert Oster Jade is a kind of light green. There's spreads out pretty quickly. The paper Plume Ivy Green is interesting, and there's that little blue at the end, which you'll see a lot. But there's two chromatographies which are kind of different in the way they look, and both of them were done as close as I can to the same method. The Pelican 4001 Brilliant Green looks to be more bluish green than green. The Private Reserve Spearmint is actually one of the nicer greens, which is unexpected to me. I've not used that in a pen yet. I got a sample form a while ago at the Fountain Pen Hospital. The KYZ Green number 5 is also a very clean green, very dark green, very consistent green. The Franklin Green from Franklin Christoph, as you can see, is a very dark, dense, definitely more on the blue side than green, but when you write with it, you don't notice that as much. And there's another Emerald Green 357 from Franklin Christoph, which is more in the green family. Alt Gold Grun, which does have some green in it, but also a lot of other different colors and looks great, great shading. There's the S&K Palm Green. And we had a little bit of a mix-up here. So across from that is the Noodler's Forest Green. Again, you'll see that the greens do have a lot of blues in them. As we get down here is the Cross Green, which is actually a pretty pure green. And then we have the J. Urban Vert Empire, which came out a lot lighter than I expected. It's interesting what resolve stayed there when we did the chromatography. So hopefully the chromatography and the sample writing with the smear was interesting, and taking a look at the extreme variations in different types of green inks in the green family. But the real test is when you ink up a pen and put nib to paper. So here's two Nemosines that I've started to use with doing inks. I've eliminated a third because the extra fine nib is just too fine. So this is the purple one, or I think it's maybe blueberry, is the broad nib, which is very broad and very wet. And then the red one has the 0.6 millimeter stub, which I've grown to really like. It's a nib that gives you enough variation, enough ink flow, but yet still lets you put a fine line down if you need to. So let's look at the broad one first, because that has less variation in the writing. Well, hopefully what's nice is this is certainly a very rich green in this broad nib. There's no mistaking it. It really flows well. I mean, that's a nice wet ink flow. We'll do a smear real time. It definitely is an ink that is interesting. I definitely say Jade is the appropriate name for this ink. So let's take a look at it in the 6mm stub. The ink is not going to be as intense as this nib does not lay down as much ink as the broad nib did, but it still looks nice. I mean, the color of the green comes through very well. This nib lays down a fine line as well as a medium line, so that's why I enjoy using this pen for looking at inks. And laying down a nice patch of ink is a little bit more difficult with this nib. And as you can see, certainly the smear is not as large. So I would say this is more typical of most nibs that you're going to have this ink in. This stub is like that. So we're going to look at a few other papers to see how it works on them. This is the Fabriano, which is a 85-gram Italian paper. It's not coated very much, so it absorbs ink fairly nicely. But still works very well with all types of inks. Now we're on Tomoe River paper. Yeah, we need to have the camera have something to focus on. This is not as absorbent as the Fabriano paper. I think that's quite evident. You can see the ink pool on top of the paper. And this is, I said, a very wet nib. You get some really interesting shading with this ink, which is quite nice and something I didn't expect. So let's take a look at the 0.6mm stub. Overall, I say I'm really happy with the ink flow. As you can see, it's still glistening. The broad nib still hasn't dried yet. And you still get some decent shading with 0.6mm. I mean, this is certainly an ink of interest. And the green does work on a lot of different levels. Let's take a look on another paper. Here we are on Clairefontaine 90-gram, and you can definitely feel how much smoother this paper is. And you can see the amount of ink that this broad nib lays down. Looks like it's not going to be quite as dark as the Fabriano paper was. More similar to the Tomoe River when it comes to that. A little smear test for you. So So far it works good on all these papers. Certainly drying a little bit quicker on this paper than it did on the Toma River. Nice. So let's take a look at how it performs on the classical cheap Staples copy paper. I mean, the intensity is certainly there. Dries much quicker, as we could expect. So I don't see a lot of feathering. Obviously bleed through with this broad wet nib. So we'll go to the 6mm stub. This is a much darker color on this paper, which is what we'd expect as it absorbs more ink. In fact, it actually looks quite nice on this paper and dries within about 3 or 4 seconds. So for using a nice green on some cheaper paper, this ink performs very well. And with this smaller nib, you're still going to see some bleed through even with the less wet stub nib. The Fabriano papers had about 5 minutes to dry, so let's drop some water on what we've written here and see what happens. What's really nice is that first initial reaction when the water hits the ink. The water is turning slightly green, so it is lifting up some of the ink from the paper. We've let the ink sit for about 3 or 4 minutes. So let's dab up the water. And it's a slight water resistance, you know, on a scale of 1 to 10, which, you know, I don't use very often. I'd say it's about a 4. So it's still legible in some areas, but not in others. This is the Clairefontaine paper. So that ink is also dried for about 5 minutes. It sat for about 3 minutes, and I think you can see that the water is definitely loosened up the ink. So I'd say we see a similar response to what we saw on the Fabriano paper. And again, the ink resistance is low medium. So in summary, I'd say it's a very nice green ink. Certainly has its place among my green inks. For color intensity, for flow, can't really comment on lubrication, but certainly the flow indicates that it is an easy flow ink. Haven't cleaned out a pen yet, but I think it'll clean out fairly well based on how it reacts to water. An ink that works well on many papers, so I give it a thumbs up. So I don't know, look and see where this ink is available. Originally it was on eBay and then it disappeared, so we'll see if it's come back or not. Well, it looks like it's available in 2 of our favorite internet pen supplier places. Vanessa and Anderson's both have them, and I'll show you some screenshots from those 2 websites. So if you're interested in the ink, I heartily recommend you give it a shot and a try. It's gotten a lot of positive press on the internet, and I think it's well deserved. May have excellent writing experiences, explore a lot of different inks, enjoy all of them on all types of paper. Till later, see you, bye.